The Marine could not put weight on his left leg, and both men standing over him knew it, and when the colonel asked him whether he could walk, the Marine looked him in the eye and said yes. It was a lie. Everyone within earshot understood it was a lie. The Marine understood that the colonel understood. There was a piece of shrapnel somewhere in that thigh and a field dressing gone stiff with frozen blood, and the man had been getting himself down the road on a rifle used as a crutch, and the shoulder of the Marine next to him, and the honest answer to the question was no. But the question had not really been about the leg. Both of them knew that too. Because to be a man who could not walk, on that road, in that cold, in the middle of that breakout, was to become a stretcher case. And a stretcher case was 4 men carrying you instead of fighting. It was a space on a truck that someone whose wound was worse might need more. It was, in the arithmetic of the Chosin Road, a burden the column had to absorb, and this Marine had decided, lying there in the snow with a colonel looking down at him, that he would rather walk on a ruined leg than be a burden. So he said yes. And Colonel Lewis Puller looked at him for a moment, and he knew the man was lying, and what he did next is the reason this particular Marine talked about him with a catch in his voice for the next 50 years. If you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Let me back up, because to understand the lie, and to understand why Puller let it stand, you have to understand what a wound meant on that road, and what the road itself was. In late November and early December of 1950, the 1st Marine Division was fighting its way out of the Chosin Reservoir in the mountains of northern Korea. It was surrounded by a Chinese force many times its size, on a single road, in the worst cold anyone in the division had ever known, 30 degrees below zero, 35 on the bad nights, a wind coming off the high ground that took whatever warmth a man had left. And in that cold, a wound was not what a wound is anywhere else. A man who was hit and went down and stopped moving began to freeze almost immediately. Blood loss and cold worked together. A body that has lost blood cannot generate heat, and a body that cannot generate heat, lying still in the snow, is a body on a very fast clock. The corpsmen did what they could, which was never enough, working with frozen hands on frozen dressings, thawing morphine syrettes in their own mouths because the drug froze solid in the cold and would not push through the needle otherwise. To be wounded at Chosin was to be in more danger than the numbers of the wound alone would suggest anywhere else on earth. And to be a wounded man who could still, somehow, move under his own power was to hold on to something enormous. Because the moment you could not, you passed into the category of men who had to be carried, and carried through a fighting withdrawal down 80 miles of frozen road under fire. And every man in that division understood, without anyone saying it, what a hard category that was to be in, and how much the men doing the carrying were already carrying. Now, here's the thing. The wounded were not left. That has to be said clearly, because the whole weight of this story depends on it. The 1st Marine Division brought its wounded out of Chosin. It brought its dead out. Nobody was abandoned in the snow to lighten the load. That was not the choice on that road. The choice was subtler and, in its own way, harder. It was the choice every wounded man who could still stand had to make for himself, over and over, every hour. Do I say I can keep going, or do I admit I can't? And it was not a small choice, because a man who overstated what he could do might collapse later, at a worse moment, in a worse place, and cost the men around him more than if he had been honest at the start. But a man who understated it, who let himself be carried when he could have walked, took a carrying party and a truck space away from someone who needed it more. There was a real cost on both sides of that lie, and the men making it were making it cold, exhausted, in pain, with no good way to know the right answer. Here's what doesn't make it into the accounts. The officers on that road knew the men were lying to them. Not all the men, and not all the time, but they knew that a certain number of the wounded who said they could walk could not really walk, or could not walk much further, and were saying it anyway because they had decided not to be a burden. The officers knew this the way you know a thing you cannot prove and cannot afford to challenge too hard, because the lie was doing something the truth could not. The lie was holding men together. A wounded man who insisted he could walk was a wounded man who was still, in his own mind, a Marine in the line, rather than a casualty being evacuated. He was still part of it, and that belief, "I can still go, I am not a burden, I am still one of you," was in some cases the only thing keeping him moving at all, and a hard-eyed officer who called the lie, who said, "No, you're a stretcher case, get on the truck," might save the man's leg and break something else that was harder to fix. So the officers let a lot of those lies stand. They watched men they knew were badly hurt walk past them on ruined legs, and they let them, because the walking was doing more than the truck would have. But there is a knife edge in that, and it is the thing Puller had to judge in about 4 seconds, looking down at that Marine in the snow. Stay with me, because what he decided and how he decided it is the part that shows you what 30 years of command actually buys a man. Because letting the lie stand was not always mercy. Sometimes it was a death sentence dressed up as respect. A man who genuinely could not make it, waved on because he said he could, might drop 2 miles later in a place where no one could reach him, or hold up the men beside him at the wrong moment, or simply die on his feet of something that a truck and a warm space might have prevented. The officer who let that lie stand had blood on his hands as surely as the officer who called a man a burden to his face. So the judgment was everything, not a rule, not a policy, a judgment made in seconds about this specific man. How bad is it really? How far can he actually go? What will it do to him to be told to get on the truck? And what will it do to him to be allowed to keep walking? And there was no manual for it. There was only what a commander had learned in 30 years about men and about wounds and about the exact point where pride stops being fuel and starts being a way to die. The accounts are consistent on the shape of what Puller did. He looked at the Marine. He looked at the leg. He did look at the leg, because he was not a sentimental man, and he was not going to let a man walk off to die to spare his feelings. He took, in a few seconds, the measure of the wound, and the man and the distance left to go. And then he did 2 things at once, which is the part that made it a story. He let the lie stand. He said something short. The accounts differ on the exact words, but it was in the register of, "All right then, keep moving." And he did not order the man onto a truck, and he did not call him a stretcher case in front of the others. And he let him keep his walk, and keep his place in the line, and keep the thing he was protecting, which was not his leg, but his standing as a man who had not become a burden. And then, quietly, without making it visible to the wounded Marine, he made sure a truck stayed close. He passed the word, the accounts say it was to a nearby NCO, that this man was to be watched, and that the moment he went down, and he would go down, someone was to be right there, and the space was to be ready. He did not take the man's pride. He just arranged the net underneath it. And this is where it gets complicated, because what Puller had done was not simply kind, and it was not simply hard, and it was not either of the 2 easy things a lesser commander would have done. He had not called the lie. That was the sentimental failure. The officer who is too soft to look a proud man in the eye and see the truth, who lets a mortal wound walk off down the road, because challenging it felt cruel. And he had not called the man a burden and put him on the truck against his will. That was the other failure. The officer who sees only the arithmetic, who is technically correct, and who strips a man of the one thing keeping him upright, and who wins the argument and loses the Marine. Puller did the third thing, the hard thing, the thing that took 30 years to learn. He honored the lie and he covered the risk. He let the man be who he needed to be, and he made sure that when the body finally failed the man the way it was going to, the fall was caught. See, what most people miss about this story is that they think it is about mercy. It is about respect, which is a harder and rarer thing than mercy. Mercy would have been the truck. Mercy would have been overriding the man for his own good. What Puller extended was respect, the recognition that a man has the right to decide how he meets the worst day of his life, and that a wounded Marine who chooses to walk out of Chosin on a ruined leg rather than be carried has made a choice that a commander should honor rather than overrule, right up to the exact edge of where honoring it would kill him. And the whole art of it, the thing you cannot teach and cannot put in a manual, was knowing where that edge was, knowing how much lie a given man could safely be allowed, reading a wound and a face and a distance, and coming up with a number that the man himself could not be trusted to give you, and then building a quiet net at exactly that number, so that the man got to keep his pride all the way up to the point where keeping it would have cost him his life, and not one step further. That is not mercy. Mercy is easy. That is command. The Marine walked. The accounts say he made it further than anyone looking at the leg would have believed, on the rifle and the shoulder of his friend, and the thing Puller had let him keep. And when he finally went down, and he did go down, the truck was there, the way Puller had arranged, and the space was ready, and he came the rest of the way out of Chosin alive, with his leg, and with something else intact that he could not have named at the time, but talked about for the rest of his life. He did not talk about the wound much. Most of them did not talk about the wounds. What he talked about, when he talked about it at all, was a colonel who looked down at him in the snow and knew he was lying, and let him. So, was Puller right? To let a man he knew was badly hurt lie about it and walk on, rather than order him onto a truck for his own good? Some would say no, that a commander's first duty to a wounded man is to save him, not to flatter his pride, and that the right thing, the responsible thing, was to look him in the eye and say, "You're hurt, you're getting on the truck," and to take the decision out of the hands of a man in shock and pain who could not be trusted to make it well. Others would say that this misunderstands what a man is and what he is owed, that there are things worth more to a man than the safety of his own leg, and that the deepest respect a commander can pay a wounded Marine is to trust him to know his own limits, while quietly making sure that if he's wrong, the fall is caught. That Puller did not gamble with the man's life. He honored it. Let us know where you land in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, make sure you subscribe.